Okay. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Homesick with me, Sophie Crystal, here on It's Not a Label. It's been a while since I've had a show, so really excited for today. Did a lot of research and I got a lot of information to be sharing with you all. The inspiration behind today's show was actually the fact that I recently went to go see Gorillaz, as in the Gorillaz legendary band, and they brought out Omar Suleiman, who is a really legendary Syrian artist. You should check him out if you haven't heard of him, but he oozes aura in like all of his performances. He's just a G. But yeah, so I saw Omar Suleiman and it got me thinking about my show, and I was like, I feel like I want to focus on a country in the Middle East because I haven't looked at music from anywhere in the Middle East yet. And initially I was thinking about doing Libya or Egypt, which are both places where I've listened to a lot of music from in the past. But as I went on and I was doing my research and going through playlists, I stumbled upon more and more music from Sudan. And even though I hadn't heard a ton of music from the country before, I thought, not only do I really enjoy these songs that I've found, I think that Sudan is a really important place to talk about right now, given the state of the country and everything that's going on. It's currently in the middle of a horrific civil war that has displaced over 12 million people. It's killed upwards of 150,000, and those are kind of conservative estimates because it's been really hard to get proper figures coming out the country, and the UN has said that it is the world's largest humanitarian crisis right now. So seeing as my show is both about music and the place behind it, the country behind it, the artists, I kind of just wanted to use my show today to both showcase these amazing Sudanese artists as well as share some important info about Sudan, its history, the conflict, and just do a little bit of what I can to spread awareness and continue to amplify the crisis, really, just to continue to amplify it, continue to talk about it, and also hopefully share some ways that you can, in your own lives, take steps to share awareness in your own life and hopefully make a difference in a small or a big way. So we're going to jump into the first song of the show today, which is called Mashina, and it is by the Scorpios.
مشينا مشينا طريق الحب مشينا حبايب لا حنوا علينا لا رحموا دموع فينا العذاب يا ناس ملقينا العذاب يا ناس ملقينا
So that was Mashina by the Scorpios. Not to be confused with the Scorpions, who I will be playing later in today's show. But that was actually recorded at Abbey Studios back in 2018 as a part of a collaboration they did with a producer, but they've been releasing music since the 90s. And I just really love the sound, and I think that part of the reason I started with that song today is because I feel like it kind of captures the blended cultural identity of Sudan, right? So the song is sung in Arabic, but it kind of has this Afro-funk vibe to it, similar to sounds you might have heard coming out of West Africa in the 70s and the 80s. So this kind of cultural melting pot is a key part of Sudan's identity, but also, unfortunately, you know, it is the backdrop for some of its problems today. And unfortunately, I don't have enough time to look at Sudan's history as far back as sort of ancient Egypt, even though it has a really long, rich history with many periods of kingdoms and sultanates kind of interwoven with Egypt and its various kingdoms all the way back to like the BC times. But yeah, like I said, we'd be here for like 3 hours if I was gonna do that. So if you are interested and want to dive deeper into the history of Sudan, there's a ton of great resources out there, and if I can find them, so can you. But yeah, so we're going to start in the 1800s instead, but before that, I'm actually going to give you like a little bit of a snapshot of Sudan's geography in case you don't fully know where it is, which would be fine and whatever. The point is, it's directly below Egypt, and then like a little corner of Libya, and then it's to the west of Eritrea and Ethiopia, and then it's to the east of Chad and the Central African Republic. I don't know, based on like how the camera's recording, if all those different compass points I'm pointed in actually correlate to like northeast, southwest, but hopefully the verbal description was enough. And then before South Sudan became its own country in 2011, the southern border of Sudan used to have Congo, Uganda, and Kenya. So what I've listed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I've listed 9 countries just there. So up until 2011, Sudan was bordered by 9 countries. Also, before the South cessation, it was the largest country in Africa, with a land area that represented more than 8% of the African continent and almost 2% of the world's total land area. Just to give you an idea of the sheer size of the country, I think that also plays into a lot of its history, right? So now we're going to dive into its history. Oh no, sorry. On top of that, I almost forgot this. Another key point of Sudan's geography is that it borders the Red Sea on its eastern frontier, and the Blue Nile and the White Nile converge in its capital, Khartoum. So try and remember all of this if you make it through the whole show, because the country's geography is it's interwoven with its fate. These are important pieces of information, otherwise I wouldn't have shared them. Right, so now finally we can start with the history. So in 1821, the ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, not to be confused with the boxer, so he conquered northern Sudan, right? And he essentially did that for personal reasons, because this was the era of the Ottoman Empire. And even though he was supposed to be like faithful to the Ottoman Empire, and like a sworn kind of ally, they essentially are the ones who put him in charge of Egypt. Low-key behind the scenes, right, he was trying to become a contender to the Ottoman Empire. He was actually trying to like snake them out and make his own empire and then fight the Ottoman Empire. So it was all a bit complicated, but because of that, ultimately northern Sudan was conquered by Egypt. It's not really anything new per se in the history of Sudan, right? Like I said, they have this long, complex, interwoven history with Egypt, but in the modern era, this is the beginning of how you could frame some of Sudan's problems today, right? So Muhammad's son and grandson continued his work, and by the time his grandson, Ismail Pasha, is in power, they've conquered the rest of modern day Sudan and South Sudan. So they were just expanding southwards from Egypt. This is all while the Ottoman Empire was still going on, but they were just going south and south and south further into Sudan as we know it. And they were like pretty happy with this situation, as in the Egyptians. I'm not saying the Sudanese people were. And Ismail was very pally with the British at the time, who were obviously still in the midst of their colonial world tour, doing up numbers everywhere. And then we have the opening of the Suez Canal in 1969, which brings a lot of attention to the region, right? Because suddenly now you have the most important trade route of its time right next to Egypt and Sudan. If you remember, I said like 2 minutes ago, Sudan borders the Red Sea, right? It's got its eastern border has got a big chunk of the Red Sea on it, if that makes sense. I've never been like a geography major, so the words kind of escape me. There's probably a proper term, but anyway, you get what I'm saying. And if you don't, look at a map. Anyway, so after 10 years of the Suez Canal being open, the UK, the Brits are just kind of like, we're not rocking with Ismail anymore. We don't like him being in charge of Egypt and Sudan. And the Brits are particularly concerned now about what's happening in Egypt and Sudan because Suez Canal, right? So they want to make sure whoever's in charge over there is in their little pocket so that they can make sure that their trade routes are all good. So they get rid of Ismail and they put his son in power, who's called Tewfik Pasha. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but it's Tewfik, which is really controversial amongst Egyptians and Sudanese, but like particularly nationalists, right? Like people who are thinking of their self-determination, because they're like, hold on, why are like the Brits/European powers having so much influence in our country right now? Like, we're not here for this, basically. We're like, what do you mean you just got rid of our leader and replaced him with his son, even though this wasn't the first time they'd done this, but replace him with his son who's in your pocket and is now going to do your bidding. So it was really stirring the pot internally. which means that after a year or two, there was a revolt by the head of the Egyptian army called the Orabi Revolt. Sorry, not result. The Orabi Revolt. And Tufik is like, I don't know what to do. I'm new here. Like, what's going on? And so then he calls up his British friends. I mean, didn't actually call them. I don't know if you had telephones, but you get what I'm saying. He's like, come save me. Like, what's happening? My own army is like revolting against me. So then the Brits come and they bomb Alexandria, which was the main port for Egypt and Sudan. And then they like overthrow the whole Orabi situation. But then this is where it starts to get like muddy. The Brits then proceed to occupy the rest of Egypt and Sudan in 1882, because they're like, oh, you wanted our help? Guess what, bitch? Now this is our little patch of land. As if they hadn't already been, you know, heavily involved in the whole situation prior to this. You know, they were already influencing the politics and the running of the country, but now they physically decided to occupy Egypt and Sudan. So most of the British forces were stationed in northern Egypt because they were obviously concerned about protecting Cairo, the Suez Canal, Alexandria, which had a big port. But their presence in Sudan was kind of limited, right? Because while Sudan was themselves occupied by Egypt, the Brits took Sudan as well, but like they didn't care as much as they cared about Egypt. So while the Brits are really focused on what's happening in the north, down in Sudan, a revolt breaks out by a religious leader called Muhammad Ahmad, who called himself the Mahdi. And so he wanted the Brits out, and he wanted to replace the Egyptian monarchy with a pure Islamic government, right? And, sorry, my bad. And so he's like, yeah, I got this master plan. I'm going to get rid of all of our colonizers, which, like, can't lie. I hear you on that, bro, because how is your land being occupied by two different groups of people? And so as a result of this revolt, I keep saying result, man, like, revolt. As a result of this revolt, they were able to get Khartoum, which is the capital of Sudan, back, and they killed like a really famous British general. So they forced all of the Egyptian and UK forces to withdraw from almost all of Sudan in 1885. So this is like 140 years ago. However, obviously if the story ended there would be nothing else to say in today's show, and also unfortunately Sudan wouldn't look the way it does today. So I'm gonna play the next track and then come back and continue the story. Please stay locked in. I promise you it's important and it's worth it and it deserves your attention. But this next tune is by an artist called Kamal Tarbas, who is often referred to as the king of Sudanese folk music. The song is really long. It's like 9 minutes, so I don't think I'm gonna have time to play all of it. But yeah, it's great and it's called Tani. So enjoy.
يغير يغير اتجاه الزول يسير في عيون النوم يودر لو في المجهول دونك فيها شي يغير يغير اتجاه الزول رأيتك مضاوي رأيتك مضاوي ترايد على جناح الخيال فريت رحلت بعيد والضاريت لا بينت لا وريت رحلت بعيد أي رحلت بعيد والضاريت لا بينت لا وريت رحلت بعيد وعن انظاري تواريت وخليت ليا في عيني صورة زول دونك فيها شي حير يغير اتجاه الزول
Okay, so that was Tani by Kamal Tabas. Like I said, unfortunately, I don't have time to play the whole song on today's show, but please go check it out. If you enjoyed it, you can find it on YouTube. Actually, not on... No, it's on Spotify too. Allah, but it's not on Apple Music. But yeah, you can find it on Spotify and on YouTube, and it's a real vibe. Really into it. Anyway, so back to where we were at, right? In Sudan's long history. So where I last left you was that we were in 1885, right after the revolt of Muhammad Ahmad, where they got back Khartoum, they got rid of some of the Egyptians and the British quite a lot. And it was looking positive for Sudanese self-determination. However, Muhammad dies pretty soon after the revolt, about 6 months afterwards. I don't know how he died. And then his successor, Abdullahi ibn Muhammad, tries to continue the mission. He's like, I want to make sure that all of the Brits, all of the Egyptians are gone, and I'm going to have my Mahdiya and run the country. But unfortunately, Abdullahi does a really terrible job. There's like no two ways to put it. We can't sugarcoat it. He basically wrecks all the previous administrative systems, and he weakened tribal unities. It's kind of like you got to go for one or the other, right? You got to... Well, ideally, you don't want to do either, but if you're going to wreck all of the administrative systems that were set up by the Egyptians and the British, you can't also be weakening tribal unities. So by 1898, so this is less than 15 years after he took over, Sudan's population had actually collapsed from 8 million people to 3 million people due to war, famine, disease, persecution. So that's 5 million people in like 13 years. So when I said he did a really terrible job, I think you can understand what I mean now. So then, of course, cock-a-doodle-doo, who comes knocking again? The Brits. they're just like, this country really is like, it really is the villain. Like in every story, like they are the villain. They are that main character. Like, I'm just so ashamed, like sometimes to be like, oh yeah, I'm British. Like, what do you mean? Obviously, I'm not British by blood. I'm British by birth, but this country. Anyway, so the Brits swoop back in. They're like, yeah, we're going to exploit all this chaos. And in 1899, Anglo-Egyptian rule took over Sudan. So there was a governor. So Sudan now had a governor appointed by Egypt and approved by the British. But basically, like, Sudan was being run by the Brits. Like, it became a British imperial possession, which is unsurprising seeing as they had so many at the time, right? And they were like, yeah, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna pursue a policy of divide and rule. So they were like, we don't want the Nile Valley area to be like unified, right? We don't want Egypt and Sudan to be buddy-buddy. And we also don't want there to be like calm within Sudan. Because the more chaos there is, then the more like, the less likely it becomes that the Sudanese people will be able to reach their own self-determination. And again, for strategic reasons, like, it's a pretty good thing for the Brits to be in charge of Sudan, right? Like, they got that little access point on the Red Sea. They can make sure everything's going fine and dandy with the Suez Canal. You get the vibe. So basically, the Brits essentially divided Sudan into two separate territories. So, oh my god, excuse me, that's so gross, I just burped. Sorry. Anyway, so in the north, where everyone was predominantly Muslim and Arabic speaking, they had a division like there. And then the south, where people were mainly Armanist and Christian, and then they forced them to speak English. So it was obviously the precursor to understanding, I guess, how Sudan ended up splitting later on. But so the Brits were behind that. They were trying to sow the seeds of difference between the north and the south. And they also invaded and incorporated Darfur into Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, which is important, and we'll come back to that in a bit. So obviously, there were various factions within Sudan who wanted to gain independence from the Anglo-Egyptian rule, right? But unfortunately, nothing was really successful in those first years of the 20th century. So when the Brits ended their occupation of Egypt in 1936, so just before World War II, they actually maintained forces in Sudan. So yeah, the Brits were really like, they were all up in there. They were there until 1952. So while the Egyptians managed to kind of like escape British colonization, the Sudanese were locked into it for another 16, 17, 18 years. And then eventually there was the Egyptian Revolution in 1952, which began to set in motion Sudan's liberation, because the Egyptians realized the only way for British dominion to end in Sudan was for Egypt itself to abandon its sovereignty over Sudan. So in 1953, they reached an agreement between Egypt, the UK, and like political representatives from Sudan in order to transition to self-government. So they signed a treaty and they were like, okay, cool, like we're going to give you your independence on the 1st of January 1956, which meant that Sudan finally became a sovereign state after 136 years of like a union colonization with the Egyptians and a 56-year occupation by the British. So that was a lot of history and not a lot of time, but I feel like before I spoke about what's happening in Sudan today, I felt like it was really important to actually set the context, because it would be a bit too simplistic to look at what is going on in 2023 or 2024, 2025 without recognizing the path that led to the conditions that Sudan is seeing today. I've been yapping for a while though, so I'm going to bless your ears with another track before I yap some more. This is Agricultural Revolution by Kamal Kayla.
I got a message for the Sudanese people. Everything at home was being about wrong. We need a really agricultural revolution so as to get a solution of hunger. I'm feeling hungry, but I need nobody to give me something. Sudanese people, I'm telling you all. Sudanese people, I'm telling you all. Everything at home was being about wrong. We need an agricultural revolution so as to get a solution of hunger. I'm feeling hungry, but I need nobody to give me something. Give me something. I'm gonna dig the land, so I can't dig it anymore. We need nobody to give us something. We have to dig the land, so I can't dig it anymore. Dig it up. To get the solution of hunger. We need nobody to give me something. I'm gonna dig the land, so I can't dig it anymore. Dig it one more time. Everybody have to dig the land. Dig it. We need an agricultural revolution. About the south of Sudan. Look at the sounds, yeah. Only war we can find. Many children are dying. No food are finding. I'm talking about the south, yeah. Many children are dying. Have to stop the war. Love and peace we are looking for. We have to stop the war in the south. Just love and peace we are looking for. We need love, we need peace, we need love, we need agricultural revolution. Agricultural revolution, so as to get a solution of hunger. We need love in the South. We need love. We need peace. We need no war in the South. Just love and peace. Agricultural revolution. Agricultural revolution. Do it. Agricultural revolution. Agricultural revolution. So as to get the solution of hunger. Agricultural revolution.
Okay, that was Agricultural Revolution by Kamal Kayla. And I'm sure you could hear when you were listening to the track, the lyrics of the song. He's talking about famine, children dying, wars. And so Kamal was one of the key figures in the Sudanese jazz scene from the mid-1960s until the Islamic Revolution in the 1980s, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But, you know, his music referenced Fela, as in Fela Kuti, American funk and soul, but he was also influenced by music from neighboring Ethiopia and Eritrea. And I think that melting pot of influences is so consistent with the melting pot behind Sudanese identity, right? And he was really political as an artist, and he was really brave in using his art to try and challenge the situation in the country and envision a different future, right, for Sudanese people. And he often sung songs in English, which gave him more freedom from censorship, which is really smart, to be honest. But yeah, you should definitely check him out. You can find quite a lot of his stuff online. Shout out to Habibi Funk, who re-released a lot of his music, and I think he has one of those magical, arresting voices, and he does a lot to share the reality of the conditions in Sudan in, you know, the 60s, 70s and 80s. So yeah, you might be thinking though, like, why was he talking about this? Because when I left you like 5 minutes ago, I left you at the point where we discussed the fact that Sudan finally got its independence, right? So ideally things should have been on the up, right? The Brits and the Egyptians have finally gone after, like, no exaggeration, hundreds of years, and people finally have self-determination. However, pretty much immediately after independence, Sudan was plunged into its first civil war between the North and the South. And this civil war lasted until about 1972 and killed 500,000 people, estimated. The numbers are probably higher in reality. But so that was the first 16 years of independence, and the reason why the civil war broke out is because the South wanted more regional autonomy and they weren't happy with the terms of independence. Obviously, a lot of the terms of the Sudan's independence were decided by the Egyptians. Were decided by the Egyptians and the English anyway, so it makes sense that within the country, given how large it was and diverse it was, not everyone's kind of like vision of independence would have been represented in that agreement. So then during the Civil War, there's a colonel who was called Colonel Gafar Nimieri. His name's quite difficult to pronounce. But so he carried out a coup in 1969. In the middle of a civil war, he carried out a coup, as if there wasn't enough going on already. So he then abolished parliament and all the political parties. He introduced Sharia law and made a questionable number of decisions regarding what to do with Sudan's economy and agricultural sector, which essentially led to famine in the south of the country as a direct result of those decisions he made. So then, first civil war ends 1972. Ghaffar is in charge, but then following that you have years of famine, particularly in the south. So then you get a second civil war, unfortunately, in 1983, and this time it's between the Central Sudanese government, so the north, and the Sudan People's Liberation Army, which is the south. So it was essentially a continuation of the first civil war. Then during this civil war, there is yet another colonel who decides to carry out a military coup. So in 1989, Colonel Omar al-Bashir carries out a military coup and appoints himself president a few years later. So in the interim period between Nimyari and the Second Civil War, at some point in the 70s, like a few political participation opportunities had returned in Sudan. Al-Bashir arrives and he suspends political parties, he bans independent newspapers, he imprisoned leading political figures and journalists. Basically, anybody that you would want to be operating in some kind of democratic framework, he just kind of bins all of them. So for example, in 1996, he was the only candidate in the general election, which, something seems a little off if there's only one candidate, right? Anyway, so he carries on his leadership by, like I said, essentially imprisoning and or killing anybody who tries to challenge his powers. Meanwhile, there is still a civil war going on. He's doing all of this while the North and the South are still fighting. So he's got his own agenda, and then the country is in turmoil. And during this war, there was actually a particularly bad offshoot of the conflict in Darfur in 2003, where a lot of non-Arab Sudanese indigenous people were killed, and al-Bashir was accused of essentially committing a genocide against Black Sudanese people. So we get up to 2005, and at this point, the civil war has been going on for 20 years, right? 22 years. It's killed roughly 2 million people, either as a result of fighting, famine, or disease. So since its independence in 1956, 50 years earlier, Sudan has seen a handful of years of peace, unfortunately, about 10, 15 years. The rest of the time it's been embattled in some kind of civil war or another, some kind of conflict, or some kind of military coup, you name it. So eventually in 2005, there's a peace agreement signed. And that peace agreement was the prerequisite to South Sudan's independence in 2011, right? So in the peace agreement, it was agreed that South Sudan would be able to hold its own referendum and separate from the North if it wanted to. And that was like an important step towards the self-determination of the South Sudanese people, who, going back to earlier in the show, as the Egyptians had pushed further and further down, were kind of absorbed into Sudan, but had a lot of distinctly different tribal and cultural and religious markers to the people of the north. So they never felt like they really should have been lumped in as one group, right? So anyway, 2011, they have a referendum. The South separates, okay? And this is after like however many years of civil war. Like, all in all, things were not good. Like, things were bad and had been bad for a long time. But in the referendum, I think something like the separation like was voted for by like, it won by like 99% or something. So clearly they won it out. And we're not going to talk about South Sudan today, unfortunately, because there's just not enough time other than acknowledging the separation, right? So then fast forward to 2018, right? Protests start to break out in Sudan as we know it today. So no longer with the South, but protests start to break out in Sudan over like the increased price of goods. Things like regular groceries had sort of tripled in price. And then also people were kind of like, hey, yo, al-Bashir, you've been here for like over 30 years. Like, are you going to step down? Like, what's the vibes with that, right? And he was like, no, I'm not going anywhere. Like, I like it here, right? I like it here at the top. So fast forward a year, 2019, there's a massive protest in front of the Sudanese Armed Forces headquarters. And they decide to intervene. And they're like, okay, actually, we're going to arrest al-Bashir, the president who's been in charge for over 30 years, and then declare a 3-month-long state of emergency. So it all just, his fortunes flipped overnight, right? But this is a man who is responsible for ultimately the loss of a lot of life. There's no two ways about it, and the imprisonment of a lot of people and the restrictions of freedoms for a lot of people. I just want to clarify, like, I am not a Sudanese and I don't have any links to the country, so I don't want to offend anybody with the information that I'm sharing. And everything I'm sharing is based off of research that I've done, that I've taken a lot of time to look into. But I obviously know with these things from the outside looking in, I'm sure there's intricacies that I would have overlooked or other narratives and stories that are really important that I just haven't had access to. So I would just like to clarify that. But based on what I've seen, yeah, al-Bashir had a lot of blood on his hands, right? So anyway, so he's gone. And then you get a joint military and civilian council being set up. And so they elect a new prime minister, a guy called Abdullah Hamdok, who previously worked for the UN Economic Commission for Africa. So it's all kind of looking good, right? Like, the country's heading more in the direction of having elected leaders who are not just interested in their own power. And so he started having talks with the IMF, the World Bank. He appointed 14 civilian ministers, including 2 women, which is very progressive. And he was like, okay, I'm going to jointly lead the country with the chairman of the Sovereign Council, a guy called Abdel Fattah el-Burhan. And that is an important name to remember. Again, I haven't actually said it so far this show, but sorry about my pronunciation. Should be a little bit better than usual though, because I did I actually studied Arabic at university, not the whole time. I did leave. Sorry, Mum and Dad. But some of the pronunciation I feel like has stuck. Anyway, this is not about me. Right. in 2021, there was a coup, right? So we just said 2019, you get new prime minister and he's leading with the leader of the council. Everything looks like it's heading in the right direction. Give it 2 years, there's a coup. Guess who did the coup? Yeah, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan is the one who did the coup, even though he was like already in charge, which I really don't understand. And I would actually be really open to somebody explaining that to me, like how you carry out a coup when you already have power. So anyway, him and his deputy, a guy called Hemedti, kind of overthrew the government, the civilian government, and declared a state of an emergency. And then he became like the de facto head of state with his army-backed government. But then, this is where it gets even more confusing. Then he decided to reinstate Hamdok as prime minister, essentially as like a puppet prime minister. But then in 2022, like not long after Hamdok was reinstated, he resigned because of like deadly protests. So that's just like a real confusing series of events, to be honest, and I spent a lot of time reading about this and I still couldn't quite make sense of it. Also, it doesn't help that a lot of, well, all of the press in Sudan is censored, right? So I'm just going off of like international reports of how the situation came about, but it's really difficult to get first-hand insight on how that developed. Anyway, so that pretty much brings us up to today, where we are with the conflict that has received some attention. So I'm gonna play the fourth song before talking to you about where we're at today, why it's important to talk about it, and what you can do to play your part. So yeah, this next song is called Hilwe Ya Amura by the Scorpions.
حلوة يا أمورة الليلة موعدنا أنا روحي بك مسرورة في انتظار لقياك وإنتي معايا شوقي ليك شديد كيف أقدر أفارقك لمواعيد جديد أشوفك في خيالي وأفضل أناجيك أقول وينك يا روحي بيتين ألاقيك عارف ظروفك قاسية وبصبر أرجاك أقول وينك يا روحي يجنني هواك قادر أصادق الليلة مواعيدنا أشوفك يا حلوة ونعيش فرحتنا ومن فرحة لقانا أغني وأقول الليلة الكون بسام الليلة الدنيا عيد
Okay, that was the Scorpions with Hilwaya Amura. I've been feeling a little bit bad vibing to the songs today because I guess the topic of today, like what I'm talking about, is so serious. But then also at the same time, I'm like, this is really great music and it makes me want to move and I really enjoy it. So I hope it doesn't come across a little odd that I'm talking about civil war and then sitting here bopping. But I think that, you know, the artists themselves are so talented and it's out of respect for their creations. So anyway, moving on to where we were, carrying on from where we were, right? So we got up to about April 2023, somewhere in 2023. And obviously Abdel Fattah al-Burhan has overthrown the government with his deputy Hemedti. And so now there's like this situation where everyone's like, okay, we're gonna like broker this plan to transition to civilian rule, everything's gonna be gravy. But then Al-Burhan and Hemedti get into it, right? So this is the main guy and his deputy. And Hemedti was the head of this armed paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces, which, if you've seen anything about what's going on in Sudan, you would probably recognize the acronym RSF. So Hemedti is in charge of them. Al-Burhan is in charge of like the traditional army in Sudan. So civil war breaks out again, right? Because both of these men want power and only one can prevail. And I do think that, not specifically relating to Sudan, but just in general, when you look at history, it's a shame how many lives have been lost because there are two men who want power and neither one wants to concede, right? And they are willing to sacrifice the lives of so many other people and not usually themselves in order to either A, hold on to, or B, gain that power. Anyway, that's a conversation for another day, but it's upsetting, right? So civil war breaks out. By the third day, it was reported that like 400 people had already been killed. The conflict escalated really rapidly, and both the Sudanese army and the RSF have been accused of committing war crimes, right? So this is, you got bad guys on both sides here. It's not like, oh, one side is doing all this terrible stuff and the other side's fine. It's like, you know that Spider-Man meme where there's multiple Spider-Mans pointing at other Spider-Mans? Imagine that, but just all with bad guys. So the RSF managed to seize the capital, Khartoum. And they actually had control of it until March this year. So remember, the RSF is the forces who were commanded by the deputy Hemedti, and then there's the Sudanese army who were commanded by Al-Burhan. So by December 2023, this is like 6 months, not even into the conflict, 5.8 million people had been internally displaced, and more than 1.5 million people had fled the country as refugees, often going south, right? Not as much into the north, so not as many people are going into Egypt, but people are going south. People are going into South Sudan, they're going into Chad, they're going into Kenya, going into Ethiopia, or they're going off that way into the Central African Republic. And a few months later, the World Food Programme released a report saying that 95% of Sudan's population could not afford a meal a day, which is, it's just staggering. Like, it's a staggering statistic. And so after just a year of fighting, by April 2024, 8.6 million people had been forced out of their homes. 18 million people were facing severe hunger, 5 million of whom at emergency levels. Like, it's just really hard to grasp the scale of these numbers, right? You hear a number like 15 million or 5 million, and it's just this really abstract term. But when you're talking about human suffering and starvation, famine, death, these are horrific statistics. This is an ungodly amount of people who are being forced into a situation where they are essentially clinging to life by any means necessary, all while Mr. Army Commander and his deputy are still having their I'm the boss contest, right? And killing hundreds of thousands of people. And so the RSF, who were the ones, the deputies task force, have reportedly been targeting Black indigenous communities. And so they've also been trying to ethnically cleanse Sudan via a genocide during a civil war. So as I said before, Sudan is this like amazing cultural melting pot where people have a mixed history, right? So there's a lot of Arab history, there's a lot of Black African history, that within that you have all the different tribes, and then there's a lot of people who have a mixed identity, right? Where all of that come together. And so the RSF is like, we want this country to be Arab ruled. We're not here for the Black indigenous Sudanese. So they've been targeting non-Arab men and boys, killing them even when they're literally fleeing. They've been enacting sexual violence on the women, which is just such a horrific, I almost don't have the words for it. It's such a horrific collateral of war, is that women will often be violated in such extreme ways that leave them permanently scarred, you know? And people often think of soldiers being permanently scarred, but my God, like I feel like almost emotional talking about it, because women and young girls have to continue with the scars of sexual violence as an act of war. Anyway, so the RSF have been doing all this, and I guess you're wondering, well, how are you guys having the resources to be doing what you're doing? So the UAE, yeah, everyone's favorite holiday hotspot, have been reportedly funding the RSF, which of course they've denied, but like, I don't know. There's people at like the top levels who are like, yeah, it's the UAE. And then the Sudanese army's main backer is said to be Egypt, because they're concerned about their border and the River Nile, blah, blah, blah. And also Turkey, Qatar, and Iran are supposedly sending weapons to them, right? And then in and amongst all of this, you just have the Sudanese people who like have not asked for any of this and are, I'm sure, I can assume, are just wanting to continue to live their lives and be able to live their lives in, you know, peace and prosperity and happiness with their friends and their family. So they're just caught in the crossfires of these warring militias who are being backed by external powers. And then on top of that, the last piece of the puzzle is that it's been really difficult for aid and human rights organizations to operate under these conditions. So, you've got months and months of blockades, bombardment, ground attacks, which has led to famine and all this internal displacement. Then Trump closed down US aid, so many local organizations, many local organizations lost their funding, and then other donors haven't stepped in. So 80% of emergency food kitchens have been forced to shut in Sudan. And this is a country of 50 million people, and 1 million of them at least are currently in a famine as we speak. And then you lose 80% of your emergency food kitchens. So that kind of summarizes what's happening with Sudan. For those of you who weren't aware, if you made it this far, thank you so much, because that's been a real journey. And I guess you might be wondering, what next? What's going to happen next? And I guess experts say that, the war is kind of in a strategic stalemate almost. So each side is waiting for a new delivery of weapons, or a new offensive, or a new political alliance, so that they can get a decisive advantage, because neither side has a decisive advantage. The RSF have Darfur, and they have territory along the border with Libya and Egypt, and they've said that they want to plan to do a rival government, which might make Sudan split again. But then the army controls the north and the east, and they've got back most of Khartoum this year. So I wish I could show you the map of who has territory where, but it's not exactly evenly split. I feel like the army has a bit more territory, but it's sorry, I'm just checking that we're not having a technical issue, but yeah, so it's not looking great, basically. Ultimately, there's no credible peace process on the table right now. There have been several rounds of peace talks in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, but both sides have basically been unwilling to agree to a ceasefire. Both sides see any form of civic activism as a threat. They've killed a ton of national aid workers and human rights activists. And essentially, the situation is that, Sudan's war is, an African problem that sort of needs an Arab solution, but it's also no one's priority. And it's just, this orphan conflict situated in a wider region, which is kind of on fire, right? While Sudan is in Africa, it is this extension geographically, politically, and culturally of the Middle East. And so there's so much going on in that region at the moment that unfortunately nobody's making Sudan a priority, which is sad, because it is, the world's largest humanitarian emergency right now, and there's no end in sight. So I'm gonna play you the last song of today's show, and then leave you with some parting remarks about what you can do with all the information that I shared. So this song is called Azara. Sorry, I keep turning myself down before I'm done speaking. This song is called Azara Al Hay, and it's by an artist called Rasha.
يا زهر الحي الحب ذيلي ومراحي صابر في الحب لم أشكو جراحي هطر المحبوب يدري عهد راحي بليالي الأمس واللهو المباح أم تناسى يا زارة يا زارة عزار الحي يا عزار الحي يا عزار الحي
That was Azara Al-Hay by Rasha. Unfortunately, I don't have time to play the whole song. There's about 2 minutes left of it though, and I really recommend you check out her music. Her voice is just sublime. And she has a really interesting story. She was born in Khartoum in 1971, so the capital of Sudan, and she descended from like a long line of intellectuals, artists and musicians. But when she was 20 in 1991, she left for Cairo because she was like, you know, there's really limited opportunities for me here as a musician as a result, unfortunately, of the ongoing civil war. But she eventually ended up settling in Madrid in Spain, and I feel like you can kind of hear that like in her music. You can kind of hear that slightly Spanish influence. But her first album, which that song is from, called Sudaniyat, was released in 1997, and it was like supposed to be this kind of reflection or this testament to the diverse Arab and Black influences, Black African influences of her home country's music scene. So yeah, go check her out. She's on Spotify, Apple Music, all of the above, and I think she's like a phenomenally talented artist. And I am gonna wrap up today's show by just discussing like what can you do, I guess, about all of the information I've shared. If you've made it this far, that is like insanely incredible, and I'm extremely grateful. And that in and of itself is doing something, right? Because you're taking a moment to educate yourself, as I have done, and I'm sure lots of other people have as well, about what is going on in Sudan. But I think that's the first step, is you engage with what is happening. And I think it's also important to engage with the country's identity outside of conflict too. So as I did today, I showcased some Sudanese artists, but you know, if you go listen to other artists or these artists, or read Sudanese authors or watch Sudanese films, but like, you know, acknowledging the identity of the population outside of them being statistics of like war and famine is, I think it's a powerful thing to do in its own way, because I've been fortunate enough to grow up in somewhere that isn't a war-torn country, and I can only imagine what it would be like if I had, but I don't know, I feel like if I was in that position, I think that I would want my identity to be more than that of the political decisions of military leaders, right? I wouldn't want to be reduced to like a famine statistic or a civil war statistic. Anyway, so engage with Sudan culturally, find artists, find authors, find actors. And then second of all, obviously you can donate to organizations such as UNICEF, Médecins Sans Frontières, the International Rescue Committee. These are all people who are working on the ground trying to combat the famine. Unfortunately, because of the crackdown on local aid groups and also Trump cutting funding to US aid, it is a little bit more tricky to donate to smaller organizations in Sudan. So if anybody has any suggestions, I would love to hear them and share them. But from what I was able to find, it seems like it's better to go with bigger aid organizations at the moment, even though I know that is controversial in and of itself. But yeah, they are there and they're on the ground. And lastly, you can just raise awareness, like talk about what's happening in Sudan. If you come across any marches or protests, you can join them. You can even advocate for political action from our pretty useless policymakers, but make some noise, make noise, because a lot of people have called Sudan a forgotten tragedy. So I think that we could start by not forgetting it. That's the first step, and it's easy to feel helpless. And like there's nothing you can do all the way from the other side of the world. But the people of Sudan deserve our attention, our solidarity, and our action. So yeah, that's pretty much everything I think I have to say on the topic. Again, if you made it this far, you are a hero. Thank you for listening to me share all my research for today's show. And if you have any questions, leave a comment somewhere. And if I was wrong about anything, I would love to be told, because every day is an opportunity to learn. And like I said, everything I shared today is from my own research, and I might have got something wrong. So if I did, let me know, drop it in the comments, and I guess I will see you guys next time on another episode of Homesick here on It's Not a Label. It's not a label. And I'm Sophie Crystal, and in the meantime, stay well, stay hydrated, stay moisturized, stay fresh. Ciao ciao for now, baby.